And hello, everyone. Thank you. And thanks for coming to the first Church of Permaculture. Today, we're going to be discussing one of, to me, one of the most important topics in the world today. A topic that some people are even calling the most important decision that mankind has ever had to make, or that humans have ever had to make. So today we'll be kind of playing around with a lot of these different ideas and talking about basically what it means to be human and where we set our kind of future we want and what kind of future we deserve. So today we'll be discussing this a specific part of the debate around biodiversity and what biodiversity means for us. And of course, there has been a big and heated topic or debate between some elements of the permaculture movement and people who are very passionate about controlling invasive species. And that question ends up being really deeply intertwined with a lot of other topics that we'll want to need to figure out as a planet. So so we're going to kind of jump right in on some of those topics today, but you know, it's always good to take a minute when we're going to talk about something that is a heated debate and controversial, kind of tune in and settle down just a little bit. When we allow these kinds of questions to be completely ruled by our knee-jerk responses, we tend to come to not the best kinds of solutions. This was actually a flute made for me by an environmentalist friend who also had a deep rooting in his native community and his native heritage. And that's also an interesting reminder today that we're all just part of a long tradition here on Earth, doing the best we can as humans, and it's maybe a good time to key into the wisdom that many of my native friends have shared with me, that we're not just talking about biodiversity and animals and plants as resources in the abstract, but they are truly part of our Earth family. They are our elder relatives, and we're just a young, rambunctious species trying to figure out our way. And these older species offer us a lot to learn from. So, you know, not too long ago, a Facebook friend of mine, Joseph Lofthouse, who is followed by many of us in the permaculture community for his gardening work and his work on landrace farming in particular, shared an interesting thought to kind of begin our discussion today with. And that thought was, let me see, I want to make sure I get it right here, get the quote right here. He said, in my spiritual tradition, there are no evil plants and no invasive species. And that was shared hundreds of times, which tells me there are a lot of people who are very passionate about that perspective and this idea that there is kind of a war on invasive species and a mindset that some species are evil. Some of our elder relatives might not belong to part of our family here. And there's definitely a strong pushback to that. And on the other side, many people who shared it. And although Joseph is often very critical of the permaculture movement, and he doesn't consider himself a permaculturist, a lot of people shared that perspective to see, look, these permaculture people do not care about invasive species. They don't care about the planet. They don't care about biodiversity. They only care about homesteading and growing vegetables. So it seems to me that both sides of this have some passion that maybe we need to learn from and listen to. And it occurred to me from seeing some of that pushback that Joseph's message that there are no such thing as invasive species and that that whole mindset was counter to his spiritual goals may have struck some people as a form of spiritual bypassing, as though when we give that kind of perspective, we're saying, we're more spiritually enlightened than people who care too much about invasive species. And that kind of I don't think we want to be giving that either. So it occurred to me that maybe we have a big opportunity here to transcend what might be a false dichotomy. Here, we all just care about building a better planet, preserving biodiversity, and bringing back a better balance with nature. And yet we're fighting with each other instead of, spending time fighting with people who are really screwing up the planet. So I hope that's what we can kind of keep a focus on today as we discuss many different aspects of this topic. We can try to keep in mind, how do we transcend this debate between the folks who are really passionate about controlling invasive species and folks on the other side, which I'm not even sure what to call the other side. Oh, maybe somebody on here will have some suggestions for that too. So a great place to begin today is where do you lie on this particular debate, and how do you see this debate? Is there really a big battle here between folks on the permaculture side and those who are trying to control invasive species? What do you think about this? Anybody care to give us a kickoff thought? Why are you joining this discussion?
I got something on this, Mike. When someone says permaculturalists are, I think it's kind of like somebody down the street from me saying Muslims are, or Christians are, or it's just a gross generalization. And I would admit that when I first started doing permaculture, 2015 to 2016, I had an idea of what a permaculturist was. It's completely different now. And if you'd asked me my opinions and my positions on things in 2016, they'd probably be a lot different than they are now. So I think we have to be careful about the generalization. And I know you weren't generalizing, you were quoting someone else. But if we are to try to find common ground, this might be good in any type of discussion or debate. I first want to find out where someone's coming from. Like, let's say you, Mike, we're talking, you got a point about college football. This is completely not permaculture, but it's something I used to delve in quite a bit. And I had a point about college football. Well, I said, well, Mike, where are you from? Okay, when I find out you're from the Midwest, okay, now I'm starting to understand some stuff. And you say, well, where'd you grow up? It's California. You say, yeah, college football is different there than Atlanta, Georgia, isn't it? So now we understand a little more about each other. We know where we're coming from. So our point's like, okay, Mike's not dumb. He's just from the cornfield. That's what he thinks about football, 3 clouds and a dust or something like that. So that's my opinion there. I think we need to ask people how they got to where they are, maybe a little bit about the origin or the etiology or whatever before we look at their points. It'll make more sense, I think. What's your take on that?
Oh yeah, I absolutely agree. It reminds me of a quote from the Tao Te Ching: "If you wish to lead people, then start by following them." If you want to change the debate, if you want to have an impact on it, then you have to start by understanding their goals and what they want to accomplish. Anybody else have thoughts to add? That brings me to an interesting next kind of question. What do we think that probably most of us here will weigh in somewhere kind of over on one side of the debate, which is maybe a little skeptical of what permaculturists have tend to call the war on invasive species. So this mindset of war with invasives. Understanding here that we're probably mostly starting on that side of the debate. What do you get out of the other side here? What are the real goals here? Hey, David, I see your hand going up. You have thoughts? I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Hey, Mike. It's been a bit. Thanks for doing this. I usually don't have time to get in on Sundays. I'm so busy, but I just want to follow up, Dennis. Yeah, good point. And it reminded me, I think it's a really good place to start too, as one of our, one way I contextualize critical thinking is start at the base. What are base points to work from? And sometimes we can call this searching for type 1 errors in permaculture when we're approaching topics to kind of name those right out front. They could be our biases. It could be, all sorts of contextual backgrounds to just start from and recognize they're in the room together. We can't necessarily get away from them. So I was doing a talk recently on Buddhist and permaculture principles. And this was one thing that really came out that I come back to a lot is there's a tradition of mind training in Buddhism called Lojong Teachings. And they have a whole bunch of really nice kind of slogans that you can use and apply in a whole lot of ways. And it really works well with permaculture. One of them is drive all blames into one. And it's related to another slogan called all dharmas agree in one point. And there's different kind of translations of the Tibetan, but those are common translations. And what the meaning of those translations is, no matter of your religion or spirituality or belief systems, in essence, the core problem that we have in humanity, and here it is in this debate, like front and center, is our dualistic thinking, us versus them, or good versus bad, or we want to be on the right side, right? All of us do. What's the right side? And we think we basically understand that permaculture in general and its broad concept is the right side to be on for so many different reasons. But if we think like that, then there's got to be an opposite side or an opposing force or the enemy or so forth. And it's our human nature and our mind's nature to think in polarity and duality because it's a subjective reality in the world around us. We experience that all the time. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing, dualism, or this role of opposites, yin and yang and so forth. It is a reality on this level to some extent, but we misplay that, and it also can be really harmful, dangerous, and erroneous in some cases, and we're going to be talking about that good versus bad plants and so forth. You know, we deal with this like head on in permaculture, and it's a huge debate, and there's a huge gray area of what's the value or not in plants and so forth. So just naming that right out front, like Dennis started to get at, this dualism is a core problem of human nature. Before permaculture, before land use management, all this, organic gardening, basic problem of us versus them that we see everywhere permeating in society. So just get that out front, and then try to work around the and Mike, you're really good about this, and part of our challenge in permaculture is reframing linguistics and semantics and meanings of words and how we choose to speak. And if we want to work with people on the other side of the aisle, so to say, regardless of your political affiliations or how fundamentalist we are as permaculture or so forth, we want to really be mindful of our language, because our language is steeped in dualistic approach, and often how we talk with people. And one of the errors in especially more young or zealous permaculturalists or people in this movement, new to it, get really excited. In a common error is using this us versus them or othering people, those who don't get it, those who are using Roundup, and really judging those. And then your conversation or your ability to dialogue can be thwarted right from the get-go by this dualistic thinking, like we're on different sides of this, you're on the wrong side or the bad side, or you're on Monsanto's, you got stock in Monsanto. And then you can hardly go from there. If someone feels judged, you're like, screw off, like you're not worth my time, or I'm going to tell you when you're done with your sentence. And so just putting that out there is great to just name it.
Yeah, like David, like Dennis was just saying, David, you're saving the world the wrong way. Save the world my way. As soon as you tell someone they're wrong, does that make them more? Have any of you ever had the experience in your life where you tell someone you're wrong and they go, "Oh, really? Tell me about that." No, it doesn't work that way. So, yeah.
So you mean arguing on Facebook is not really going to change anyone's mind?
It's funny, but agreeing on Facebook might help be a better way of changing people's minds than arguing on Facebook. But yeah, thanks, David, for bringing all that in. It's a really weird thing, isn't it true that when we think about, we have a tendency, a thought, the same thought problem David was talking about, is our tendency is to think the opposite of a bad idea is going to be a good idea. But usually the opposite of a bad idea is not a good idea. It's another bad idea. And the good idea you get to by figuring out, parsing out which parts of both bad ideas are good and which are bad, and building a new, better idea. And I really think that that's the way forward. And for all of us who are working in our local communities, and sometimes coming into conflict with people in our local communities around this debate, that should always be the goal, is instead of telling those people they're wrong, it's just not going to get us anywhere, figuring out where they're right, like I think both David and Dennis started saying, and building something new on top of it. I really think that's, if we as a permaculture movement started to think more like that more often, we might have fewer of these sorts of conflicts. And I think I saw that Noah was interested in adding something to the discussion too. And it's a good time to kind of start to introduce Noah here. I did ask him to be a bit of a special guest today, or guest today, and that that doesn't mean that everyone else isn't also a special guest today. We're all special guests, but Noah's just for people who don't know Noah Madlin, he's just been a very long-term permaculture student and involved in the movement in many ways, and studied with Bill Mollison himself, and is one of the best read people that I know of in the movement in terms of permaculture, and also has always had really insightful things to say on this particular topic. So Noah, did you feel like thank you again for joining us. Did you feel like you looked to me like you had something to weigh in on?
Just to start off, I have not personally studied with Bill Mollison. I met him twice, first in 1991, then in January 2012, when after he had his 5th heart attack, he was in Tasmania. I think permaculture from its inception, from the personalities of people like Bill Mollison, and there are many others, they were, how do I put this, flamethrowers. They liked inciting controversy. Bill Mollison was asked, do you work with native plants? He said, yes, of course I work with native plants. All the plants I work with are from planet Earth. So my first personal teacher was a man named Dan Hemingway, who I think he's still around. I'm not in contact with him anymore. A brilliant man. If he's still around, he's around somewhere around Spar, Florida. But my first permaculture design course was with Dan Hemingway in Jacksonville, Florida. Quite an interesting place. And then I spent 3 months with Dan Hemingway in Dahlonega, Georgia. They have an invasive plant called kudzu. Yes, Dan Hemingway created the kudzu utilization project. So those phrases gives you an inkling of the way that permaculturists look at things versus the native plant communities. Permaculturalists often, but maybe not always, look, how can we turn this opportunistic element into something positive? How can we, one phrase, one of my teachers, Dan Hemingway, said, how do we turn a lemon into lemonade? This seems to get the native plant community, they're very challenged by this concept, okay?
Right, if kudzu has a use, then it's not the pure evil plant that we believe it is. And there does seem to be a strong need to feel that certain species are like, evil species. They're inherently bad, right? There's like, and maybe some of that comes from people who do a lot of biology degrees these days. One of the very common things that they do is go to work eradicating invasive species in local ecosystems and conservation projects, So a lot of times when I talk to people, they will have had an experience of fighting kudzu, or in my region, the one that's really common is garlic mustard. So people, and they'll go back every year. Their freshman year of college, they'll go and they'll do a battle, go to battle against garlic mustard, and they go back their sophomore year, and it's just as bad as it was their freshman year, and they battle it again, and then their junior year, they go back, and it's just as bad again. It's an endless battle against this invader that's destroying the ecosystem. And they go back their senior year and it's still there, and there's never any progress against it. So I understand when I talk to those people, they're like, no, don't eat that plant. It's an evil plant. Of course, I love to make pesto from it. but they don't want to hear about no garlic mustard pesto. This is an evil plant. They've battled it for years.
So Dan Hemingway gave me an assignment when we went to the back of the supermarket, and there was a whole hillside of kudzu. And while he was doing something that permaculturists like to do, which is dumpster diving, I don't think you'll find native plant people dumpster diving. But he had me harvest a massive quantity of kudzu and bring it home. And we fed it to his rabbits. And his rabbits absolutely devoured this kudzu, favoring that over the leftover produce from the supermarket. It was obviously a lot more nutritious. But back to some of the beginnings of our conversation, I just rewatched a interview with Doug Calamie, and I think he has a lot of good points to say. And I think
Before you continue, for people who aren't familiar with Doug Calamie, do you want to mention who he is?
Doug Calamie is perhaps the leading proponent in the United States of controlling invasive species and replacing them with native species for the biodiversity that native species create for the whole food web. He's, I think, the emeritus professor at the University of Delaware. So Doug Calamie said his 4 top goals are support the food web, support pollinators, especially specialist pollinators, manage the watershed. He said the biggest destroyer of the watershed is lawns. That's, okay, my opinion, partially true. Permaculturists definitely do not like lawns, even though one of my criticisms of permaculturalists, lawns, if we're intelligent, can have a lot of benefits for our permaculture designs if they're polycultural lawns. And then his 4th goal was sequester carbon with long-lived, dense perennials like trees. And his number 1 tree is the oak tree, the most biodiversity-rich supporter of the ecosystem. And I think permaculturalists can definitely get behind planting more oak trees. Oak trees produce acorns. We don't value acorns enough in the permaculture community. So all of these goals of his, I feel like permaculturalists definitely support all those goals. And I think good permaculturalists actually actuate those goals. So, yeah. And what David was saying, the binary nature of human thinking, we like controversy. We like, well, some of these are invented controversies. The controversies between another subject, the vegan community and the non-vegan community, that's also exaggerated a little, I think. But
oh yeah, definitely. You know, what you were just talking about right there made Doug Calamie sound like he's a permaculturist. I'm for all those things. And by the way, I have another quote here from him too. Maintaining our lawns in their prestigious weed-free states has become quite a toxic undertaking. 40% of the chemicals used by the lawn care industry are banned in other countries because they're so toxic. So there, you know, as again, Doug Calamie talking about lawns, and yeah, elsewhere he said that lawn watering accounts to 30% of all water used during the summer in the East and up to 60% in the West. So there are a whole lot of ways in which Doug Calamie comes off just like a permaculturist. And maybe, you know, and I've actually spoken at 2 conferences where Doug Calamie was also the speaker. I was just a schmo speaker and he was like the keynote speaker, but I got to speak with him and at conferences after him and around him. And my perception is that he actually is not a big proponent of using pesticides. In fact, in that one quote right there, he even said, a lot of these pesticides for the lawn care industry are highly toxic. So that's Doug's message. It's a little bit more like permaculture in a lot of ways. Now, he has also made specific statements that are that he's skeptical of agroforestry food systems and stuff like that. He's definitely not necessarily a fan of permaculture projects. He likes to see native plant projects and pure native plant projects. But he's not a big he doesn't go out there saying spray all your invasives with glyphosate. He just says get rid of all your invasive species. And after I spoke after him one of the times that I spoke at a conference with him. And when I got into there, the room was filled with people. And I swear to you, I was going to talk about permaculture, and the first 6 questions people got after listening to the Doug Calamie talk were, oh my God, how do I kill all of the invasive species in my yard? And that was the very first question someone asked. And the second question was like, oh, I have my grandmother's daylilies and I love those daylilies. They remind me of my grandma, but now I have to kill them. What can I use to kill these daylilies of my grandmother's that I love so much? And so people take that message that we have to have these pure native ecosystems, and then they jump on it. And what do you do to kill them? Well, you got to use these same poisons that Doug himself is saying, he's somewhat critical of. But that part of the message, he's soft on that part of the message because he's so passionate about maintaining and creating native ecosystems. So people hear that, and what's the solution? Well, you need poisons. Yeah, Noah?
Imagine those who have done much of the poisoning, not wanting to poison plants. The invasive species trying to get rid of invasive species, right? Like the Anglo and Celtic American is one of the most invasive species.
I think one of the things in this invented controversy that we're missing, the invented controversy between the native plant community and the permaculture community. We live in Western or European or whatever phrase you want to describe it as. It's not a war on invasive species. It's more like a war on nature. So that's why people have been brought up to, somebody says this is bad, now I got to kill it. I spent much of my life in suburbia, and it was quite challenging because somehow I, as a person born in New York City, I don't know how it happened, but I learned to make a connection with nature. Maybe some power above decided that I should connect to nature. But everywhere around me, all year long, it was a battle. Clearing, spraying, monoculturing. I have a friend of mine who I'm doing a small gardening project for. She doesn't like insects. She lives in a community called Gaia. It's an eco community. They give people a plot for a vegetable garden or whatever they want, a food plot. They have a community composting piles. They have a community tool shed. right outside her front door, there's a gigantic fig tree that her neighbor is growing. And when she moved in, the previous person had a lot of milkweed plants in her little garden outside her front door. She wants to remove the milkweeds. So her sister cleared the milkweeds, but milkweeds being a very, how do I put it, opportunistic, determined plant, regrew. She didn't take out the root mass. So I think permaculture is milkweed is a wonderful permaculture plant. It benefits the whole ecosystem. They do have a habit of hosting the milkweed bug, which is very obvious. You can see it. It flourishes on the milkweed plants. And I think it's a little toxic to like birds and things. So it doesn't seem to have a lot of predators. But I explained to her, insects and plants are co-evolved. You cannot remove the insects. So we're in a culture that is alienated from nature. It's not really about the native plants versus the permaculture community. It's the alienation our society is brought up with from the natural community. And I'm going to change the subject slightly.
Okay.
If that's okay. I was listening to a discussion with Dow Orion, the opposite polarity of this supposed controversy.
Right, an author of a great book, which is Against the War on Invasive Species.
She said a lot of the native plant communities are like relics of the native people's cultivation of the landscape, which is an interesting point of view, that they're like cultivated systems. They're not just abstract things growing out there on their own. So us as Europeans, that's a very hard concept for us to get around, that there's really no human-free natural community.
Right.
We think we can fence off this area and call it a national park, like Yosemite. Oh, there just happened to be a Native American community there that was removed so they could create this national park. Or some other places out by near where Pamela lives, where they had national forests or national parks that Native people used to live there, say in the 19th century. But when we came to the Western Hemisphere, Europeans, Charles Mann wrote a book, a series of books, 1491 and 1493. The whole of the Western Hemisphere, it seems, was cultivated by native peoples. And when Europeans came, like in the 1600s and 1700s, after the native communities were all moved out west or killed by various diseases, all these so-called wild plant communities started growing up, and the idea of the dense, dark, primeval wilderness, that was regrowth of the landscape after the native peoples were removed.
Yeah.
It wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a unnatural phenomenon.
Yeah, and I would also like to second those books for anyone who's interested in this debate. Charles Mann, those two books are great, and his more recent book, which is Wizards versus Prophets, takes on another slightly different part of this debate, and shows a continuation of this theme of thought. And really what we're talking about, and really this whole discussion, is about what is the balance for humans in ecosystems. And on one side of the debate, as Noah was just pointing out. And by the way, as kind of a part two to this whole discussion, I'd like for us to kind of talk a little bit more about the current scientific community debate on this whole topic too. And even Mark Davis. Mark Davis is an ecologist at the University of Wisconsin, who's actually the first author, the author of the first academic textbook on invasion biology. The name of the book is Invasion Biology, and he cites exactly what Noah was just saying too. In fact, Mark Davis, as an academic in the field of invasion biology, the guy who wrote the first textbook on invasion biology, actually recommends to dissolve the field of invasion biology. To get rid of it, he says it's a pseudoscience. He says that a lot of the elements of it have been debunked by research. And this is his own field, he doesn't like the term invasive. And one of the reasons why, one of the myths that he identifies is the thing that Noah just pointed out, that there's an old environmentalist myth that's actually caught up very much in racism, that where old environmentalists believe that this was a pristine nature, a pristine continent before Europeans arrived. And so a lot of the whole native philosophy, the native plant philosophy and native ecosystem philosophy, is about restoring a pristine nature that never really existed. It was always a myth. And even the leading scientists in this whole debate agree with that. So it's an interesting point there, and I just wanted to interject that. Yeah, please continue.
I think there's a lot of room for collaboration between the native plant community and the permaculture community. Though the permaculture community, is going to have to look in the mirror, and we really enjoy controversy in the permaculture community. I mean, COVID split the permaculture community incredibly apart. And the homesteading community and permaculture community here in Western North Carolina was divided unbelievably by COVID. And there's still, people won't talk to each other on both sides, supposedly, from what I've been told. And David Holmgren in Australia came out on one side of that, and he was at the center of a huge controversy. But anyway, back to this. One thing I wanted to point out that's not brought out is the best permaculture designers that I have personally seen. Their sites are unbelievably full of biodiversity. The Jeff Lawton's farm in New South Wales has an incredible amount of birds, pollinators, all kinds of snakes, all kinds of wildlife. Eric Tonesmeyer and Jonathan Bates' place in Holyoke, Massachusetts. Jonathan's not there anymore. Once you create a perennial polyculture system, I think the point I'd like to make out is that a lot of the landscapes are underplanted. A lot of our landscapes are under-vegetated, under-natured. Permaculture likes to fill up the plant communities. One issue, we like to what they call accelerate succession. One thing that I don't understand, that we have to have a discussion with the native plant community, maybe we can create an edge effect. If you create more robust plant communities, you're going to, by definition, reduce the opportunities for invasive plants. Like Mike's concepts of terminator guilds. But a lot of native plant people, maybe this is I don't know if this is a correct statement, but my small observation, they just seem to remove the offending plants. Sometimes there doesn't seem to be a plan for what to do afterwards. So if we could come at this from a place of good communication, empathy, empathizing with people who are passionate about native plants, and not as permaculturists always seeking to stir up controversy. If we could listen to the other people carefully, maybe we can discover ways we can work together to enhance biodiversity, carbon sequestration, more opportunities for specialist pollinators. All those things are in a good permaculture design system. Enhance the watershed, but planning, do we have a plan for what we're going to do when we remove the native plants?
Yeah, that's such a good point. This brings us back to really one of the other key points that really the leading scientists on conservation ecology in the world are pushing at. And like I said before, an interesting point is that a lot of times the people who critique permaculture say that it's like to frame this issue like it's science versus permaculture, because again, people go to get a biology degree and they get a 4-year degree and they spend their 4 years at war with native species, literally going out and spraying them. And a lot of the people who get jobs as biology grads get jobs as pesticide applicators and spraying and stuff like that, and contractors, or they're doing conservation management, and that assumes they're going to be spraying the ecosystems with poisons too. So we're literally giving people degrees in how to spray corporate-made poisons. Like that's really what the job option is. They learn a lot of really amazing stuff. I'm not trying to denigrate their degrees, but the jobs available for the degree programs are oftentimes spraying poisons. So so a lot of times then it gets framed as though this discussion is permaculture against science. But really the leading scientists in the world on this are all kind of backing Mark Davis's approach. And that includes like the head of the Department of Invasive Species. I mean, it's right there in invasion biology at Cornell, a major university on this. And it includes one of the world's leading ecologists, Hugh Possingham. And he's from Australia, but he was the first head of the Australian Center for Biodiversity, created the world's first center for computer ecology. He went on to become the leader of the Nature Conservancy, the head scientist for the Nature Conservancy. And now he's doing a speaking tour in the United States, trying to push back on this idea, on this war on invasive species. And they're using language that we permaculturists should be adapting. And so like Hugh Possingham's thing is that the cutting edge best management practice of today is not war on invasive species. And the way he frames it and the way Mark Davis frames it and Art Shapiro and all these other research ecologists is that the old paradigm was exactly what Noah was just saying, that North America was this pristine, untouched nature with no humans, right? And we humans came and finally messed it up. And the people who were living here before, I guess, don't count as humans to this perspective. And So they came and they messed it all up. We came and we messed it all up. So all we need to do to fix things is remove the invasive species, and a magical, untouched nature will re-emerge if we do that. Of course, now we know the science of that is wrong, the history is wrong, but then we also now have decades of studies. And according to Davis, Davis covers all of this in his textbook, which is a review of the literature on invasive species. It's been covered extensively in the journal Invasion Biology. So there's one particular scientific journal, peer-reviewed journal, that's largely associated with this field, and it's the name of the journal is Invasion Biology, and it's extremely controversial with other biologists. But not only that, it's extremely controversial with the biologists who are involved with invasion biology. In fact, a majority of the peer reviewers from that journal said that we should just get rid of the whole term invasion biology and invasive species. So it's extremely controversial, but the whole idea was just what you were saying. All we have to do is remove the invasive species and the ecosystem will regenerate magically. But now we have decades of research and that never happens. So what happens when we remove the weeds? What happens in your garden when you remove the weeds? Usually they come back, or bigger, worse.
More weeds, maybe the same, maybe different, but more weeds.
Yeah, and so that's exactly what's happened in the research too. So the new paradigm that folks like Hugh Possingham are supporting is an alternative to what's called invasives management, and it's called priorities-based management. And priorities-based management is doing exactly what Noah was just saying. You start with setting your positive priorities for what you want to see in the ecosystem. That could be enhancing biodiversity, sequestering carbon, managing water cycles, which Doug Calamie said was one of his major goals, reducing chemicals that we're using on lawns and fossil fuels. We could set all those positive priorities and come up with a plan for measurably improving on all of those areas. And guess what? A lot of times we can achieve those goals without ever removing a single weed or invasive species. So it's just a matter of getting of talking to some extent with people who are those, native plant people, passionate about native plants, about those same things. Is that about what you were thinking, Noah?
It sounds good to me, but we still need to figure out how to communicate with people interested in native plants, to not dismiss their concerns, to listen carefully to how do we form an edge effect? How do we I asked my friend who's a conservationist, why are people so emotional about native plants? And why, when someone like myself would ask, can we step back from the situation and look at it without emotion, how to move the situation forward, how to handle the invasive plants in a positive way? He said, well, people have different values than you know. And then today, one of my friends here was clearing Japanese knotweed, and they put it in a gigantic trash bag. And I made a strange comment that only I would make. I said, well, we can turn that into fertilizer. We can put it into a barrel and ferment it, and it would kill the seeds and give it life and make fertilizer. And my friend said, who the hell has time for that? I said, Noah. Well, I don't really have time for that. I have to work on other issues, but that shows you the way that a strange way a permaculture looks at things. How to turn things negative into a positive. And the native plant community, I asked my friend, what is it about this? And she said, it's something that I can do. She has a habit of going around the backwoods here. And here in Western North Carolina, there's a vast amount of what are called invasive plants. We get a lot of rain here. Things like to grow well here. I don't think people are managing the landscape very well. Maybe they're not managing the landscape is the point. The things in Bill Mollison, I'm reading Introduction to Permaculture. He says, get a small area under control. Things are not under control out there in the landscape. Some people, maybe they have too, as you said in your classes many times, maybe people have too large of a space to handle. They can't handle it. So we have miscanthus grass, we have bamboo, we have privet, we have Russian olives, Japanese knotweed, Paulownia, empress tree. There's a very, very long list of things. And what was I saying? Okay, it goes back to the war against nature. How do you?
Yeah.
It's not a war against an invasive species. It's a war against nature. How do we, as permaculturists, have an open heart and listen carefully and not put people who care about nature in another camp? How do we listen to them? Why don't we explain to them good permaculture design site has an incredible amount of biodiversity?
Yeah.
Yeah, I got something to add, Noah.
Please.
Oh, okay. I'll let you go, Mike. We just had something on the page, Transformative Adventures, that's similar to what you're getting at here, Noah. I brought up an idea about camphor. I've got just a ton of camphor growing on my property here. On the property I've been blessed to steward. Let me put it that way. Just a ton of them. Now I keep them chopped up, and I throw a lot of them out in our scrub area. So we've got 2 mature ones, and then we've got just, I mean, it might be 6,000 square feet of where a third of everything growing is camphor. So it's great. It's biomass, indeed. I don't want it to turn into a forest, but I wanted people's inputs and opinions on whether I could use what some call an allelopathic personality trait, use that, chop up the leaves and twigs and throw that on areas that I use for paths. It would be the biomass for the paths. And it also, maybe it would have a little bit of a weed killer personality. And then one person piped in and said, oh, no. Person who lives not too far from me, this is invasive. It's worthless. It's worthless. It's invasive. Well, that was her opinion and probably her experience where she lived, which is not too far from where I live. Even though we live 40 or 50 miles apart, our soils might be completely different. And the plants that do well where I live might not be the ones that do well where she lives in Florida. Well, another person got on from China having a world of different experience. It's a native plant there. It would probably never, technically it couldn't be classified as invasive. It might be aggressive, instinctive, opportunistic, okay? And they made, according to this person, they made great furniture out of this. Well, the other person, based on her world, her myopia, if you will, I don't want to sound mean there, but what she saw, and she was like, you're wrong. Her language was harsh. She said, you're wrong. You're just not, I don't believe you. And that's what she said. And I was like, whoa, look at this. So I said, hey, let me get admin involved here. We have some great admins that can calm stuff down a little bit, do a little soul saving, and let's get all back on track. And come on, we're all in this together. I'll make a long story short on this. That person wasn't about to be amended. It wasn't about to join the team on this. It's very just narrow focus. So what I'm thinking is on this discussion of, okay, that would be a cat trying to get some of the limelight there. Let me move that cat out of the way. There's probably another one coming.
Was it
but
a cat invader invading the niche of the camera?
Yes, invading my space right here. Okay, where was I going? I was going somewhere intelligent with this. I really was. The cat's coming again. Okay,
No,
you stay down there. I'll pet you. Oh, I know what I wanted to comment is we don't have the same definition of terms. We don't have the same definition here. I think a lot of times when people think on invasives, some people of the camp, it either is invasive or it is not. There's no middle ground. Everything is black and white. And we see a lot, I think David was speaking a little bit earlier about this politically. If you don't agree with me and I'm on the right, then you are on the extreme left and you're horrible. If I'm on the left and you don't agree with me, you're on the extreme right and I don't have to talk to you because you're just wrong. And I close off. I want to read you, this is a book and I haven't read the book yet, The New Wild by Fred Pierce, 2012. And he's got his first paragraph here. He says right away, he says, on language, I have used a lot of words in this book to describe species moving to new places. Most frequently, I call them aliens, not in a pejorative sense, but to describe their status. More for variety than anything else, I also call them vagabonds, invaders, carpetbaggers, migrants, interlopers, non-natives, incomers, and no doubt more. Humans carried some aliens deliberately or accidentally. Others arrived by more traditional means, borne by winds and waves or under their own terrestrial, marine, or airborne propulsion. I save the adjective introduced for those carried by humans. Then he goes on to say, for some ecologists, invasive has a particular meaning. It applies to those aliens making waves and making territory. Sound familiar, huh? Equally, when species settle down and appear at home, they will be termed by some naturalized. I generally follow the practice using both terms, but please judge the species I describe by what they do or don't do, and not by the label attached to them. And I remember reading that before, and I haven't read much of this book. I really got to get through this book. But it's not black and white. And I think we need to talk to people. If we're in the permaculture camp, we're going to use species for benefit for the entire ecosystem, and not just because they were here when Colombo got here or whether they weren't. I think we need to introduce the idea, maybe talk in terms of this gray area where, some coconuts come to South Florida from Africa, and they might carry seeds or this or that or the other. For sure, they carry some soil. So even the soil that we have in South Florida, for example, some of it may have come from Africa. Well, that's not native. What do? Take that coconut and that makeshift raft or driftwood, send that back to Africa. It's not black and white. That's what I'm getting to. And language is important. I think people, Noah, you've made some awesome points. Mike, as always, you have. David, I like hearing what you said. And I think I'm going to hit you with a friend request unless you find some reason to not accept. But anyway, I think this has been a good discussion. Thumbs up for
Dennis,
everybody.
Dennis, I'd really like to focus in on something you just said there, which to me is really what I'd love to get at. Because even some of the language I was using, like if people are focused in, what's the right medicine? This is something that we could all think about. What's the right medicine for the case at hand? If someone is really focused in on the science and they say controlling invasives is the science, then the right medicine might be to show them, hey, check out Hugh Possingham. He's written a bunch of papers on priorities-based management. Hey, you want to control garlic mustard? Here's a bunch of studies. Check out the Transformative Adventures group. You'll see a bunch of studies that show that non-intervention combined with priorities-based management is better than spraying or controlling garlic mustard. We've got the science. Here's the science. So if and Pamela, we'll get to you in a second here. I'll make sure I won't just bulldoze over you. I saw you. And so if the science issue is their thing, the science is the medicine. You know, tell them about, introduce them to priorities-based management, try to push them towards that. But for other people, it's this thing that Dennis was just talking about. It's a passion. It's something that's very emotional. These are invaders. Camphor or garlic mustard can't have any good properties. It's an evil plant. I have done battle with it. It's almost like the plant version of a terrorist. How, you know, I really feel like nothing we've said has captured validating that emotion and understanding what that emotion is. What does that person really value? Is it, and this is a question, is that about a way that they can personally interact with the destruction of the planet? You know, we all, I think, have to process the human destruction of the planet. And here, these people have done battle against the destruction of the planet by battling camphor, by battling garlic mustard. To them, it becomes a very personal representation of the harm that humans are doing to the planet. And I don't know if the process of transcending that false dichotomy starts with that or not, but it's like, that's, you know, we should not invalidate those kinds of statements. We should find ways to validate those, it seems like to me, and then build on that. Because if it's an emotional thing, telling people that they're wrong or showing them science on it, like you can show, if someone's done battle with garlic mustard, you can show them 10 studies where about garlic mustard, and they're going to be like, no. It's passion, it's emotion. And Pamela, did you have something to add to that, or?
Yes, it doesn't relate to how to diffuse the battle, but it relates to how to view some of these plants. For instance, Japanese knotweed is very, very high in resveratrol, which is an antioxidant, which is of incredible value for our health. I can't rattle it off right away, but I mean, for incredible, I mean, especially right now with all the pollutants. And many,
especially your heart, especially heart health. It's a major thing for heart health. It's the chemical that's in red wine that's responsible for the French paradox, where Europeans eat all this sorts of cheese and fatty foods and still have better heart health because of that resveratrol.
Okay, and then it's also useful for other things too, where an antioxidant is in line. And some of the most expensive supplements that you can buy are, the main ingredient is resveratrol. And so there is, it's like, this is insane. I mean, well, strong language. There's a potential to see this in a different light, and to see, I mean, what is the #1 killer in the United States? It's heart disease. And I do have a friend who works harvesting Japanese knotweed and selling it. And it's quite a job because formidable root systems, and it's mostly in the root. And there is actually, oh, and then another plant like this is mugwort. And mugwort in Chinese medicine is one of the most revered plants for its therapeutic value. And there are mugwort sticks that are used in place of acupuncture needles. And personally, I'm planting mugwort, and people are warning me, woo! But and then also also there's a very wonderful book called Invasive Plant Medicine, which talks about a number of such plants. And it's written by somebody with a very, very deep background. I I forget the name right now, the author's name, the very deep background in naturopathic medicine and Oriental medicine. And this is it's not flaky, but it's a very unusual outlook on the
Yeah.
whole.
Another great
Oh,
suggestion. I'm glad that we're having, let's come back to you. I'll come back to you, Pamela, in just a second.
One small little sentence. Okay.
Okay.
Because it just seems as though there's a generic thing that I've observed, that many of the plants that are considered so invasive, they are that because they are so powerful. They have these powerful plant compounds, which can and many of them are therapeutic. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, and Noah, I see you got a hand up too. So, and David does too. So I want to make sure I get back to both of you guys here. But I want to point out too, we mentioned Mark Davis before, who wrote the book Invasive Biology, the first textbook on it. And he said that one of his breakthrough moments was that he was out doing, he actually led a huge research project on garlic mustard. So they were doing control of garlic mustard. And what they found is there's been several studies like this, that control and spray of garlic mustard only increased the garlic mustard over time or made it never go away. It just kept coming back. But on the control sites where they did nothing, the garlic mustard declined and went back into balance. But he said that when he was doing that study, he had one time when he was walking down with a group of people and they were spraying the garlic mustard, right? So they were spraying glyphosate on garlic mustard, and they stopped for a break. And following them down the trail was a group of Native Americans, women and children from the local tribe, and they were out harvesting the garlic mustard for their food. And they were literally harvesting the garlic mustard that the white science crew had just come through and sprayed with pesticide. And it occurred to him that this is also can be an environmental justice or an environmental justice issue. And you mentioned, and I read that, and at the same time that I read that story from Mark Davis, my own community in Kalamazoo was having a bidding thing, request for bids on controlling Japanese knotweed, and it was at a piece of a park that was literally just like a short walk from the food co-op, and the food co-op sells bottles of resveratrol. Right. And and that's almost all of that that's imported. It's almost entirely imported to the United States. And the main source globally is Japanese knotweed. So what we were doing was hiring people who were white biograds, who were upper class people, to come in and spray poisons on a people of color neighborhood next to a food co-op that was literally selling that plant. Why not take that money? We're going to spend tax dollars on it. In Michigan alone, the bookmark for it was like $30 million bookmarked for control of Japanese knotweed. That's $30 million that we're paying to a big corporation and to almost exclusively white middle-class people to spray poisons on this plant that we know is incredibly ineffective and is harmful to ecosystems. Why not use that $30 million to pay people of color and low-income people who live in the places where most of this problem is at, to harvest this as a resource, process it, and then sell it at the food co-op so that we don't have to have it imported from China? I mean, to me, this is the problem is the solution times 10 right there. So thanks for bringing that up. And I think I saw David's hand first, so please, you. And then Noah, I'll come back to you.
Yeah, thanks. A lot of great comments here. So just to add a little bit about my background, because part of what we're doing is sharing and learning what resources and what people can contribute so we can connect further about specific things. So I've literally been paid hundreds of thousands of dollars over decades to remove invasives for people. And it's been a really interesting experience. I've learned a lot. And so it's a core aspect of the business I do. I've been running a business for years, and do a variety of things, but in general, it's kind of landscaping and land use management, and then permaculture, horticulture, gardening, a lot of things mixed in with that, handyman kind of stuff, irrigation, so forth. So what it's an interesting process meeting clients where they're at. And here's just a few examples. One client, wealthy woman from Japanese, has a home, an amazing multi-million-dollar property in the woods, really in nature, some really neat landscaping, some of which I've done, some which was previous. A few years back, Japanese stiltgrass invaded our county. 5-6 years ago, they identified it. It's a new thing here in South Michigan. And so I identified it. She called the county. You're supposed to report it, these new invasive species, so-called. She called the county. Next time I came back, I saw flags around and spray spots. Talked with her about it. They came, they identified it. They started a program with her spraying glyphosate spots. I said, okay, I don't like this, but she's the homeowner. She's making her own decision. I'm going to watch this, talk with her about it. She trusts me enough, so I was able to evaluate and talk with her about it. After a couple times they're visiting and I observed what they're trying to do, I said, look, ma'am, I didn't react immediately when I first came and saw them do it. I waited. And after a few visits over maybe a month, I said, look, I said, do you see what they're doing? They're going to come every 2 weeks or whatever. They're going to keep spraying glyphosate and they're not going to eradicate it. You're going to have poison ground here. You're not going to beat the stiltgrass. The stiltgrass will win, and they're just going to keep poisoning. It's fruitless. It's a waste of time and it's detrimental and so forth. Just call them off. So she did. What I see now for 5 years now, Japanese stiltgrass is invading all over the place. It's on most of properties. I manage over 40 properties, hundreds of acres of land, and so part of the point I'm getting at is I'm in a role where I relate with a whole variety of different clients and properties on all different levels. Some could care less about permaculture, don't know anything about it. I don't even use the term permaculture with most people I'm talking about it, but I meet them where they're at, and I'm in a position where most of my clients, well, all my clients really trust me, but I have new clients that I'm building a relationship with, and I take that time. I look at it as a long-term relationship where if I can build trust and we can develop dialogue over time, then I can get into their ear and their heart, hopefully, and influence their direction with their money. I've had clients pay literally like $5,000 over a summer for people to remove like ferns or something day after day for hours and hours, or remove a juga from the lawn, or nitpick on creeping Charlie in the lawn or something. And I'll let people do this for a little bit, but also as they develop trust with me and they see that I'm a frank, forthright person and they can trust me, I'll tell them either first off, depending on what it is, or as we go down the course a little bit and build relationship, I'll tell them, look, ma'am, with all due respect, this is a waste of your money and it's a waste of our time. And we won't do this, straight off for some things, or some other things. We'll do a little bit, get our foot in, develop relationship and trust, and then be like, look, you want us to spend our money, your money and our time doing this, but there's much better way to do this. And, and then I'll give them some perspective. I always think long-term perspective. I'll say, we could do this the rest of the year or the next 5 years, and you'll spend X amount of money, $5,000 over the next few years, or $10,000, whatever. And your lawn, your property will be the same. It will still have this stilt grass. It'll still be all over whatever the grass. So let's make a management plan that's more reasonable and look at your goals and hopes and visions and aspirations, instead of just flushing money down the toilet. And, and then I'll be clear to them, like, look, I'm not here just to make money as a business relationship. I'm here to relate with nature and encourage your relationship and, yada, yada, and so forth. So I'm constantly in this role of having to show up on a property and discern amongst the hundreds and thousands of things I can discern with my background in horticulture and botany and, tree work and, all these different things, gardening, farming, and discern, like, what do I even talk about? What do I even point out? What's a, waste of time? We have 10 minutes. You can't just, I see much more than they could possibly see. And another example is, I'm too busy. I'm really too busy, but I always say open to meeting new potential clients, meeting new people that I get introduced to. I don't advertise or have a website or anything. It's all word of mouth. So last year, somebody said, hey, there's somebody that needs some help. Are you open to, yeah, I'm too busy, but I'm willing to talk with anyone. So it actually went over his property. It turned out to be the mayor of Ann Arbor. So terrible property. They just got it redone. They just bought it, got a whole redone. They put sod grass in, and it was already starting to fail. That same season, it got put in the spring. It was in the fall, starting to fail. The landscaping just like the worst. Like people who don't know what's going on with gardening, like boxwood and a few hostas and stuff like that. So I said, okay, this place sucks in a certain sense. Like it's not a place that's exciting to me. I don't want to like take care of this landscape, but yeah, I'll do a little bit of weeding for it. Yeah, sure. You want a few more plants for this autumn? Let's put some bulbs in this thing. Just start a relationship with them. And then what I found over last fall and then this year, it's like, yeah, they're starting to listen to me. I interact mostly with his wife, but him also, the mayor, and I'm able to talk about permaculture. I'm able to talk about these principles, get him in. He goes to the city council meetings. He goes back, with these thoughts in mind, and my slow process of kind of education and putting these things into them. And they're open and they want to learn about these things. But if I went, if I showed up their property, be like, sod, grass, like this place sucks, like it's uninteresting, it's uninspiring, it's I don't want to take care of, I don't want to weed your stupid little thing back here. It's just not what I do. If I would have been judgmental or whatever, told them you got to do this or that, or rip out your lawn, or what the hell, you don't know what you're doing, or acted arrogant or whatever, like forget it. I'm not gonna, get anywhere with them. They might as well just have the old standard landscaping company come and do the regular rounds. But so for me, it's a wonderful process of learning to meet people where they're at. And I bought a friend's lawn company a couple of years ago, not because I promote lawns at all, but because I wanted his electric equipment, first of all, so I don't use any more two-stroke engines. And then I bought his small client list, 10 clients. And because I knew some of them from previous work with other companies and stuff, and I knew if I started talking with these people, most of them are elderly. So number one, they need someone they can trust and that'll talk frankly with them and not just rip them off, and will meet their needs and help them to just be stress-free in their later years. So get a foot into their, into the door in that sense with them. And then I knew when they found out I was a horticulturist and so forth, then they'd have other projects. I could start taking care of their yards, including start chipping away at their lawns. And let's take this chunk out. Let's see how that grass doesn't even grow there anymore. Forget it. Quit putting grass seed down every year. Let's carve this bed out, bring in some natives, et cetera, whatever. So meeting people where they're at. And, of course, I won't do chemicals. I won't do this or that. But I've been mowing a few little lawns after basically like 20 or 30 years ago, saying like, I'll never mow a lawn again. I did that as a teenager. I did that as a youth. But I found like it's a part of being humble about it to do a little practice or work, or even mow, a 96-year-old lady's little tiny lawn for free. Because, it's the human dynamic, as mentioned, Mike and others have said, can we listen deeply and find the heart of the matter and care for people without judging, and then we can start to work with them where they're at. And then over time, even just one person could then take it back to their group, their nonprofit, or the mayor back and say like, look, like, we can do better here. Let's bring in a new city policy about invasives or something. I've been learning about it, and you never know what kind of difference you can make. But these personal relationships and talking with people about that, it's a huge part of the process here. Then and right from the get-go, not getting this dichotomy of like, you got this all wrong, like let me show you how to do it all right. but really picking and choosing, like you're saying, Mike, with our intelligent management, and selective management of property, that's constantly what I'm doing. Like I see these properties, I'm like, forget it. Like, don't spend $10,000 in the next year or two trying to deal with this back wild section, because it's a way, you know, you're not gonna conquer it. You're not gonna conquer it. Let's spend your money on something more useful, you know, and you know, more
Yeah, Dave.
reasonable. Don't waste your money.
Yeah, David, that was like a master class in that idea of if you want to lead people, start by following them. You know, what is it that they really want to do? What are they really concerned about in their own yards? You know, start with that and build on it. That was beautiful. Hey, and you gave us an opportunity to talk about a specific, you know, so when we're talking about, and yeah, you also gave a great example of doing this priorities-based management kind of approach. You know, that's a fancy scientific name for it these days, but it's really just what's been taught in permaculture circles since Bill Mollison, which is that you set a bigger idea of what positive things you can do, and then do those things instead of only focusing on the control issue. You gave us a great example of something, you know, like stilt grass or garlic mustard, something like that. You know, if you look at those studies, you've got two options. You can commit to spraying the garlic mustard or pulling it by hand, and you're going to be doing that pretty much forever, the research says. You've committed to a forever war on that plant. So the alternative we're talking about for people who aren't familiar with it is, instead, what would you like to see there? Usually the idea is that an invasive plant is bad because it harms the local biodiversity. It kills the native plants and reduces the biodiversity. In a lot of cases, that might not be true. Like with garlic mustard, again, it's been studied now, and it actually does not hurt the biodiversity the way we once thought it did. So in fact, there's been many studies, and they have not been able to find and measure any reduction of biodiversity or native biodiversity due to the garlic mustard. So, but just, you know, if I just told people that, they would probably react strongly to it, especially if they're responsible for that landscape. But if you talk to people about, like David was just saying, what are the positive things we can do here instead? Instead of the old paradigm that all we need to do is remove the garlic mustard and a pristine, magical ecosystem will reappear. If we want to see more native biodiversity, why don't we just install more native biodiversity? You know, if we're going to spend 10 hours, you know, or 20 hours a year working in this area, instead of spending that 20 hours fighting garlic mustard or autumn olive or whatever it is, why not spend that 20 hours and that money installing, you know, 10, 15 new species of vigorous spreading, useful native plants? Then you've accomplished your goal of increasing biodiversity. You've done it. You've done the thing. You've made it more useful. You've increased biodiversity, maybe made it more beautiful. Like Noah was saying, you've filled up more niches, so there's less room for garlic mustard, less room for weeds. Now you have measurably accomplished that positive goal without spending a single hour at war with the invasive species, you know? It's just a very different approach to it. So I love that you brought all that in. Hey, Noah, I know you had a hand up for a while, so gonna call you back into this discussion here.
Let's see. I think David was wonderful what he was talking about, meet people where they're at. But the native plant community is not really where they're at, is eating the garlic mustard or turning the Japanese knotweed into resveratrol. They're not there at the moment. So, but some things I wanted to discuss is, how is it that Native American people were able to manage vast landscapes in creative ways. They didn't have 330 million people in what we call the United States of America. I don't necessarily know the answer to that. I know there's a gentleman in the Midwest who's got a indigenous landscapes company. He's trying to promote native food plants. There's lots of native food plants here in what used to be Cherokee land. But another concept is called the Milwaukee Forest. And I would like to know, maybe Mike knows more about this than I do. How small can you scale down the Milwaukee Forest concept? When I spoke to this with Jeff Lawton, he said that's basically how we planted a food forest. You just pack in a huge amount of plants, you overplant an area. And it's sort of, oh, I guess I got to get that book. I don't have that one. But Jeff Lawton, he looked at the Milwaukee Forest and he said, that's how my friend Kate Baxter in New Zealand in the early 80s or 90s, how she created a food forest. It's like a massive planting in a small area. So how small can you scale down a intensive nucleus planting? That's one scale I'm talking about. And the other is the macro scale. How did native peoples manage the landscape on a macro scale? So I guess those are two opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. I think I did that wrong too. Here, let me, fix that. Okay. So, yeah, the thing that Noah's talking about, this Milwaukee technique. Milwaukee was a forester in Japan, and he studied forestry. And because, as a Japanese student, at the time when he was in biology, everything was American. All the universities, the academic institutions in Japan, you went there to learn the American way. And he learned the American approach to forestry, which, you maybe, he may have learned, you plant out your plants like this in wide spacings in rows and at quote, research-based spacings. These are still called the research-based spacings, maybe like 12 feet apart, plant these trees 12 feet apart. Well, the thing is that Milwaukee recognized is that that American system was all based on maximum productivity, usually of a crop, either of wood for the forestry or of walnuts or something like that. And Milwaukee was looking at native ecosystems in Japan just regenerating. And he was like, they happen way faster and way easier, and they don't look like this at all. Of course they don't look like this. So Milwaukee looked at the spacings that were happening in natural ecosystems, and they were much tighter, about like a foot apart. And so he recommended planting plants into, and he also said that American style forestry, they were usually planting monoculture. So you'd plant like, 7 rows of pine. And if you wanted to have a polyculture or diversity, then you'd have, 7 rows of a different kind of pine. That's what your biodiversity would look like. So instead, he did things like this and planted in really close in a triangle. And he noticed that in nature, in natural systems, there were always a mix of different successional stages. So you'd have fast plants like pines or black cherries, and then you'd have mid-succession trees like oaks that take a little bit longer. And you'd have late succession trees like beech or maple, and they'd all be growing in together. So he recommended having a minimum of 3 species, planting them in really densely, about a foot apart in rows that look like that, always interplanted. So in each triangle, you'd have, one early succession, late succession, and mid succession. And he mixed them all in this way and sourced them from local parks. He would go, instead of ordering seeds from Burpee, or plants from Burpee, he would go to a local park and find the seeds there that were growing in his own area and bringing those back and planting them out. And so a completely different paradigm for reforesting based on useful native plants, and not always native plants, sometimes, useful plants. So a very different paradigm. And yeah, so it worked, and it works really well. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, and the other book that I showed here, how do I clear my drawing and stop here. So the book I was showing here is Native Plant Agriculture, created by Indigenous Landscapes. And this is the first volume, so I recommend that book as well. It's a very pretty kind of coffee table book too. It's filled with beautiful pictures.
Mike, just
Yeah.
to go back for a second to what you were just talking about with the triangles. So let's say I have 3 persimmon trees. Am I planting 3 persimmon trees in a triangle? Is that what you're saying?
No,
Am I planting
probably.
3 triangles with persimmon and something else in each triangle?
Yeah, let's, here's what
I'm sorry.
No, this is a great question. So what Milwaukee found was that this really rapidly helped in establishment. And a lot of permaculturists like Jeff Lawton have used a very similar thing, like Noah was saying, but adapted a little bit. So Sandy, here's how I would recommend adapting something like that. If I were going to plant, and I wanted to establish a persimmon tree. Now, if it were a small site, a small garden, I would plant the persimmon tree there, and then I would plant a bunch of support species, again, at about a foot around it like this. And they might not even be trees, they might be whatever support species I had, because I would be helping this persimmon tree to thrive. But still, that dense planting will probably help that persimmon tree thrive. But if I were doing, this is something I recommend a lot on big sites. So if someone had several acres and they wanted to establish rows of food forests, so they wanted to establish like multiple rows of food forests, and they want to have persimmon, they want to have, let's say they want to have persimmon trees, and they wanted to have different species. So I would still plant, they want to have a row of persimmon trees, something like that, just as an example. I would plant the persimmons, and I might try to seed in other things, but then I would plant around each persimmon like this with those support species. So I would adapt this to it. And this is what I gather Jeff Lawton does too. So all of these green dots, can you see those okay?
Yes.
So the green dots would be support species. These I might go and get from a local park again.
Okay.
And so maybe this would be things like what I love for something like this, Catalpa in our region. Catalpa is really fast growing, really easy to cut, produces lots of seeds, germinates really well from seeds. I get Catalpa, maybe a black cherry, and maybe a couple of older things too. But here's the mean part. These would primarily be sacrificial plants. So as this comes in, it's going to look a lot more like, in the first year, the persimmons might be this big, right? Or a couple years, they might be this big.
Mhm.
They might start to grow in other things. And our support species then, might start to look like this. As the support species, or as the persimmons grow, I chop and drop, and use those support species as sacrificial species to enrich the soil carbon. While they're there, they're great for biodiversity and wildlife. They're enriching the soil. They're doing a lot of work during that period of time, and they're slowly being phased out as the persimmons come in. Now, this is for sites that are really difficult. Like if you're working on Jeff Lawton's site, you're in the tropics and the soil is terrible. This kind of species or plan of using sacrificial or nurse species to establish the trees we want can really work well. I mean, on like sites with terrible soil, I love this because, you know, people who have terrible soil can have like 60% plant mortality. Well, if you're going to have 60% plant mortality, you know, maybe 60% just free seeds that you got from a local rest stop or something like that is better than you losing 60% of expensive trees that you got from edible landscaping.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. That's much clearer to me.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm glad that we were able to integrate in a few practical things to this discussion too. And, you know, I'd like to spend a minute coming back to this idea of really listening to people. I feel like we could do more thinking and more exploration in our own communities about what is that emotional issue there. Like Dennis was saying, a lot of times it's people want to do something. And it's not that they want to do something necessarily against invasive plants. They want to do something to heal the planet and stop the destruction of the planet. And the garlic mustard in their yard or the Japanese knotweed is only their, you know, their personal representation, their personal version, experience of what this monster is. So maybe that's a real clue for how we can help meet people where they're at. You know, one thing that I was planning on talking about a little bit in this that we never got to was the history of the war on invasive species. And I just want to bring it in again while we're thinking about that representation in people's minds and trying to understand where they're coming from. I just like to for people who don't know, the history of the war on invasive species, which is covered a little bit in Dow Orion's book, and it's covered a bit in a great piece of paper called Invasion Biology, History of a Pseudoscience or Critique of a Pseudoscience by Theopopoulos. And that's available online as a PDF. And he was a professional landscape manager and a scientist who became very critical of the, you know, spray everything and invasion removal paradigm. And the history of it goes back to a scientist, an early ecologist named Charles Elton. And the war on invasive species began with a radio program. Charles Elton had a soldier, was around World War II, and was influenced by all of these radio shows recounting invasions and invasion reports on the radio. And this is what he was thinking about. And he had an opportunity to do a radio show on this new topic that he was exploring as a science, which was invasive species. So he is one of the people who first documented and proposed invasion biology. And he was also a great kind of showman. So when he had this opportunity to do this show, he didn't want it to be dry science. And he had this idea of making his radio show like one of these radio shows about the war. And so he covered invasion biology in this radio show as though the plants were literal invaders, like the way they talked about the Nazis and the Huns, and characterized them that way, and characterized them as, and the radio show even played bombs exploding and stuff like this. So it sounded like a war report. decades. And this started that whole idea in our mindset, our minds, that this is a literal war, that these plants are literally invading us and bombing us, and that they're evil like Nazis. And so we kind of owe this whole history of invasion biology to really someone who overstepped his role as a scientist to become an advocate and was really just a showman trying to do good radio. But maybe these days, this war mindset is no longer conducive to helping us build healthier ecosystems together. So that's just one more thing. But whenever we talk or think about people who have this, like, passion about these invaders, it's because maybe they have learned and inherited a whole way of thinking about this that goes back to Charles Elton and documenting this as a literal war. Yeah, Pamela?
Okay, this is something that I've been wanting to say for a long time. The conversation becomes way wider than anything we can deal with today. But I recommend, there's somebody who's been very, very inspiring. His name is Charles Eisenstein. And he's written an incredible book called, many incredible books. One is The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible. And what he has been trying to do for decades with great wisdom and restraint and intelligence is understand the basic dynamic in Western culture of wanting, if there is some situation that they oppose, to destroy it. The warlike mentality. And that this pervades, if you think about it, it pervades many, many of our activities. And so he is talking about envisioning ways that we can go beyond that. And heal that. And he's very inspired by indigenous people who believed that they were one with nature and that their way of relating to nature is to work with it. And so that sounds, I've heard that before in permaculture. And then also, I really want to recommend an action group. Scroll down, pretty far down actually, to Susan Opitz. Oh, you could speed it, do a search for Susan Opitz. To Susan Opitz post about a book that has recently been published by a woman named Lila June, who is by descent Diné, which is the Navajo word for their tribe. And this is her doctoral dissertation, 400 pages. It's her doctoral dissertation talking about how indigenous people I think it's just for the northern North America. How did they set up these ecosystems that were giant food forests, giant regeneratively productive, very productive food systems. And this is going to be one of the lead books that's going to really open this up. And I have been following her for, 10 years or so. She's an incredibly intelligent woman, very, very, she's so wise. She's so compassionate. She's so empowering. And she's the daughter of a woman who's a very good friend of Charles Eisenstein. So you can begin to see how the threads apply. And
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that too. Yeah, she's an artist and musician and has done a lot. Hey, you reminded me, Pamela, this whole war mindset we have. Isn't that a weird thing about us Americans? And think about it. We've had a war on poverty, and we've had a war on drugs, and we've had a war on terror. How did those wars all work out? Did the war on drugs get rid of drugs?
no, the war on
We need a war.
war on
We need
cancer.
a war on organic gardening. We need a war on organic gardening, I think.
Yeah, let's have a war on organic gardening. Exactly.
I missed
and
that.
this is true, so how do we expect the war on invasive species to end up? And the funny thing about that is it is working exactly the same way. We've been talking about Japanese knotweed, another poster child for invasive species. Guess what? The researchers doing the science on Japanese knotweed, guess what they said? We're talking about a plant that only very rarely has the potential to replicate itself from seed. It doesn't spread clonally very far from runner. And so how has this plant become so invasive? The people researching it have said the number one cause of Japanese knotweed invasion is the war on Japanese knotweed, because it's been completely so hyped up that people are going into, if they get a small piece of Japanese knotweed in their yard, they go crazy digging it all up, create a bunch of propagules for it, because every little piece they break up is a propagule. And then they go and they dump it on the side of the road someplace. All of these patches of Japanese knotweed spreading, it's almost entirely from people trying to remove it. And it turns out they've identified that the professionals being paid to get rid of it are one of the largest sources, because they have to pay to throw this stuff away in a special dump, because it's like high level toxic waste, because it's considered so invasive, this plant. And so what do? They dig it up, and instead of disposing of it the proper way, they take it and they dump it all over by the side of the road someplace. So now we have this industry that is $30 million industry in Michigan alone, and it's being paid for by taxpayers. And the people that we're paying to control this problem are the people who are responsible for spreading the problem. I mean, that's good job security, right? But it's that same idea. The war on invasive species is becoming the reason that's causing the spread of the invasive species. And that's not just us permaculture wackos saying that. That's the scientists studying Japanese knotweed saying that. So yeah, does this help get in touch with those people? I think when we're talking about this is preaching to the choir, right? So this kind of thing might help once we've established relationships. But I really do believe that the bigger thing that's come out of this discussion is starting not by invalidating people's feelings on this topic when we talk to them, but starting by validating their topics and then saying, yes, and maybe here are some other ways we can think about it and control it. So yeah, Pamela. And also, let me say this. Thank you all for joining. And I want to say, Pamela, and then anybody else who has last thoughts to add to this discussion. And we're about out of time today.
Okay, I just wanted to add that statistically, it's likely that over half of the people working so hard to remove the Japanese knotweed are going to die of heart disease.
And could use that resveratrol.
Yeah, might have prevented it.
We are so self-destructive sometimes. So dopey. Okay, wow. That was my last comment.
Right. Hey, the problem is the solution. Every dopey human thing is a way that we can grow.
There you go. Hey, Mike, do you have some ideas of the dates for September's workshops?
It'll probably be the week after. So the next first Church of Permaculture will be the second Sunday, and then that Monday and Wednesday. That will
Monday
usually,
and Wednesday.
Yep. Same schedule this time. I think we'll just stick with that. It's working for most everyone.
Okay,
So we'll
good.
stick with that, and
Thank
we'll
you.
be talking about paths. And maybe we'll get into doing a class on soils too. Advanced soil class. Yeah, Pamela?
Well, okay.
Dennis added here in the chat, the transitional ethic. Nobody goes from zero to sustainable overnight. So I need to meet them where they are, which starts by me getting to know why they got there. Yep.
Yeah, and what I want to say goes right along with that. And it really hooks in a lot with what David was saying. And that is that when we, like, our nervous system has two parts, the fight or flight part and the rest and digest part. And the rest and digest part also is what increases the circulation to the forebrain. And so basically, and the fight or flight part gets all the blood going to our muscles so that, and it rushes out of our head and into our muscles. So when we start fighting with people, mentally or physically, that happens to us. And so one of the things that, I mean, in terms of physiology, that's that underlies the things that David was saying, is that and a lot of Taoist teachings, just calm down and you'll come up with better solutions. And that's also something Charles Eisenstein talks about that a lot. He's very influenced by Taoism, by the way.
As long as you live in love, let nothing trouble you. Life is only too short, and time takes its toll. Again, a good opportunity and message, Pamela, for us to all stay centered. So thank you everyone who joined us for this discussion. Thanks, Noah. Yes, you did bring some great stuff to it. I'm so glad that that you were available and could chat with us about this topic. And for everyone else who joined the discussion, I thought this was a great discussion, and we're going to, it's been recorded, so we'll be posting it on YouTube, and hopefully other people in this permaculture movement can use some of these thoughts and ideas to help in transcending this false debate in their own local areas. So thanks everyone for joining, and I will see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
I'm going to stop the recording now.